So it's a real pleasure to be able to join the conference. Wasn't able to make it last year, and I've really, really enjoyed myself. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and thank you so much for all of you for all of the wonderful insights that you've provided during these last 2 days. I have to say, when I read the programme and realised that I was described as a guru, it's the scariest billing I have ever had. And that, sorry, I should go back. That's broadly what I'm going to talk about. But this guru word, a guru. And I thought, okay, on the one hand, I can only fail to meet the expectations that this provides. You know, that somehow you're going to go away from this feeling inspired, thinking, oh God, that was just so wonderful, so inspiring, all this intellectual and spiritual wisdom. No. On the other hand, I thought I could all too easily meet expectations. Those of you who work like me in business and management schools will know the word guru is often used in quite derogatory ways. Peter Drucker, who's described as a management guru, says people call him a guru when they really are just too embarrassed to say charlatan. And I thought maybe I could meet these expectations. And then when I sort of looked, there's a lovely Business Week article called Management Gurus, Visionaries or Charlatans, and the accusations that are levelled against them. Confuses rather than educates. I've done it. Rarely rises above the common sense, you know, stating the blindingly obvious. And having listened to wonderful presentations and contributions over the last 2 days, I'm thinking, gosh, I'm going to be stating the blindingly obvious. Faddish and contradictory. Anyone who's, say, read several things that I've written will think, oh, doesn't that contradict something she said earlier? So I think I stand accused. My only hope is that at the end of the Business Week article, when they were coming to their conclusion, what they said was, well, on the positive note, if you can dig through all of the waffle, you may find a nugget or two in there. So let me begin the waffle, and let's hope that you can find a nugget or two in amongst it all. What I want to talk about, I'm mainly going to talk about findings from a recent project that I completed with 2 of my colleagues at St Andrews, where we looked at what knowledge mobilization, we call them agencies, people who are taking, seeing knowledge mobilization as a major part of their role. And when I say role, I mean the agency role, not just the individual role. And then I want to just finish up with a few brief reflections from a wider set of experiences. This was the project, and I know some of you in the room have heard either Hugh Davis or myself speak about this in other forums, so please bear with me. But it was a project that was funded by the National Institutes for Health Research, and we were looking at knowledge mobilization, how we could improve knowledge mobilization. Because it was funded by a health organization, you know, the idea was to improve healthcare, but as part of this work, we were also looking at what agencies were doing in education and social care too. So we do take a cross-sector perspective. This was, you know, our objective, that we were going to identify what people were doing and particularly how they designed and implemented their knowledge mobilization strategies. And we were trying to sort of collate and analyze across these 3 sectors. It involved 5 main activities, some literature work, some desk research, and the sort of agencies that we were looking at were research providers. So research providers, and you know, one of them that we looked at was CRFR, Sarah Morton's unit. So research providers who had a major focus on knowledge mobilization. We looked at research funders, so research funders who saw it as part of their work, so people like Joseph Rowntree in the UK, who see knowledge mobilization as a core part of their activity alongside funding research. And research intermediaries, those who see themselves working in this space in the middle that several people have referred to. We did some in-depth interviews with 50 such organisations. We surveyed over 200, and we got 190 responses, so a broader range, and we had 2 exploratory workshops, which is where some of you have already heard a bit about this work. What I want to say a little bit about is, so what do we find? And what we found won't surprise you, I don't think, especially after I've heard all of the comments today. If we think of what Vicky was saying earlier when she was talking about what sort of knowledge broker are you, those same questions about who, what, why could apply as equally to the agencies. And across the range of these organisations we were looking at, we found varying emphasis on the types of knowledge they were trying to mobilise. Yes, of course, they were looking at mobilising research knowledge because that was part of our selection criteria. But the extent to which they were trying to mobilise other knowledge alongside that, practitioner knowledge, developing peer networks alongside the mobilisation of research knowledge, varied quite considerably. They varied quite a lot in the types of use that they were, what they were seeking to do, the why bit of Vicky's framework. Some people were obviously trying to create instrumental change, changes in practice that could be verifiable, look concrete, could tell a good, tangible impact story about them. But others were focusing much more on just trying to change mindsets, what we would call more conceptual impacts. And others were much more advocacy organisations. So if research was going to be used symbolically, tactically, that was fine by them. So different sorts of use being sought by the agencies. And they involved a range of different stakeholders in terms of, in this sense, diverging from Vicky's framework, in terms of who they were trying to reach. They were looking at different audiences in terms of also who they saw as the main actors, those who could influence those they were trying to reach. The level of resources, the centrality of knowledge mobilisation for these agencies also varied. All of them saw it as important, but then when you looked at what budget they allocated for knowledge mobilisation alongside their other activities, that varied enormously. And the issue of then how that was funded, who pays. Some of them were centrally funded by government. Others were subscription funded. So much more the potential users paying for this work. They varied in the extent to which they were tailoring what they did for specific contexts, for specific projects, versus adopting much more of a one-size-fits-all approach. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And that links to the fact that they were focusing on different sorts of activities, again, very much in line with Vicky's framework, quite a lot of people were focusing on producing and sharing knowledge products. Some were more focused on trying to facilitate change, and a final group, they're seeing their role much more as brokering relationships and brokering debates too. Just to sort of unpick those last 3 categories, here are some sort of common or typical quotes. The minute we just put things on the website and hope that people see it, and that they'll, sometimes we try and draw a bit more attention to it. So a lot of focus on putting stuff out there, through to linking and doing sort of hands-on implementation work, and then trying to build relationships, sometimes, a lot of the time between practitioners and researchers, but also between practitioners and other practitioners in the same field or in terms of multi-agency work. What we identified when we started to ask people about this range of activities was lots of uncertainties and tensions. So we're getting now into the dark side. I think the dark side of knowledge mobilization applies not just to individuals, but also to agencies. Lots of uncertainty and some tensions about what people were trying to achieve, their purposes, their goals, and also the terminology they were using. I thought you might be interested just in one bit of the survey evidence. When we asked people what terminology was being used in this field, and lots of people were talking the language of evidence, not knowledge mobilization. But most of the labels that we have up here were name-checked by at least a quarter of the organisation, so there's a wide range of terminology being used. And in the interviews, people were telling us they use one language internally and another language externally. So some people would say, yes, we're comfortable talking about knowledge mobilization within the agency, but we would never use that term with the people we work with. So these multiple terms serve different purposes in terms of how acceptable what they were doing was likely to be seen. In terms of other uncertainties and tensions, we've got a definite tension between those who are seeing knowledge as a product, something which can be created and shared, as opposed to knowing as a process, something that is knowing in the moment in a specific situation and is deeply situated and embedded in that process. There was also quite a bit of tension trying to find a balance between knowing and doing on at least two different fronts. The first of these was efforts to secure a robust evidence base and robust research products versus evidence to getting them used. So quite a lot of agencies were saying, in order that we feel confident to share this knowledge, we need to do so much work around synthesizing. You know, we said we would synthesize the knowledge base. When we started to look at it, there was much more out there than we ever anticipated. It is taking us a long time, but we're not happy sharing it until we're quite secure that this is good information that we're trying and good knowledge that we're trying to share. And the other tension was, or the balance was between people who were who wanted to know about the process of knowledge mobilization and what they actually did. So it's the tension between people doing knowledge mobilization and then also researching knowledge mobilization, reflecting, evaluating their activities. And most people said that they were focusing much more on the activities than really trying to build the knowledge base around knowledge mobilization. Overwhelmingly, the message that came across from the interviews and the survey was that people were struggling to not just push. It was very interesting in the interviews, almost without failure, everyone recognized the importance of going beyond pushing. But when we then sort of reflected on what they were actually doing, 90% of it was often what might be labeled push. And they were just saying, it's just so difficult. You know, you need, especially if you're a project, to get up and running and deliver something within a particular time period, you have little choice but to develop the knowledge products and then disseminate them and share them as well as you can. Trying to engage more interactively is much more resource intensive and time consuming. So that struggle to not just push, as this quote illustrates. Something else that I think that surprised us was around innovations. There was a real reluctance to, when we asked people about, what are you doing that you consider innovative, very few people volunteered anything instantly. That most people were saying, well, we're doing this, and almost apologetically saying, well, we're doing this. I know it's not new. It's new for us. But there were some really exciting things happening. And interestingly, quite a lot of the exciting things were around creative ways of pushing. So that first category. And I think because people were apologizing for not having moved beyond pushing, they were reluctant to share some of the imaginative ways in which they were beginning to share information. But also, there's quite a lot of skepticism about the extent to which others in this area were also innovating. As the quote there illustrates, that sometimes when they hear people talk about innovations, they think, oh, that doesn't sound terribly much at the sort of the front edge, the edge of innovation to me. We also asked people about what was driving what they were doing. And what we found was that a lot of people were talking about problems in the sector or sector changes, the integration, health, social care, within England, the devolution of much of the decision-making to head teachers within schools. So these sort of sector-level changes were driving the focus of knowledge mobilization activities. Quite a lot of people saying, well, we appointed this person. He, she had a particular set of skills or a particular network, and we just exploited those. So a lot of serendipity, often associated with particular individuals. Stakeholder funders requirements, we've heard quite a lot, both from Canada and from the same is true in the UK, about the ways in which funders are requiring people to write research impact plans at the time they get their funding. So a lot of emphasis on responding to funder requirements, doing what they think is required as part of the project that they have. And an awful lot of muddling through. And again, that's not meant necessarily derogatorily, because within the business and management literature, within the public policy literature, Lindblom, the art of muddling through is quite an acceptable way of thinking of strategy, although some of the muddling through is a little more elegant than others. There were some what we call dogs that didn't bark, which we were also interested in. So using models theory, now you won't be surprised that having heard David and various others in the audience say, when we talked about sort of the models theories of how you might improve knowledge mobilization, some people were aware of them, but mostly what they were saying was they're interesting, but I can't operationalize them. I can't see practically what I do tomorrow. So they're having to go some way from the model, and it wasn't really driving what they were doing. Learning from evaluation, oh yes, it would be nice. Many people were not doing much in the way of evaluative work, and we're saying that we've hardly got beyond the happy sheets really of instant user feedback, and so there wasn't a lot of that happening. Looking to other organizations, oh yes, we should be doing that, and forums such as this, of course, are great in that respect. But it surprised us how, and especially in some of the workshops, how little people knew about what other agencies were doing and how much effort they were making or not making to learn from what others are doing, especially in different sectors. Involving the public and service users. Yes. And this really surprised us because in many of the service areas we were looking at, education, healthcare, education, involving the public service users in terms of design of service delivery is important and has made some strides. But the extent to which people were actually involving service users, members of the public, in thinking about their knowledge mobilization activities and actually doing the knowledge mobilization activities was very limited. There were some notable exceptions, and so there are things out there that we can learn from, but very much at the margins. Out of all of this, we began to think about, well, when we begin to pull together all the strands of the work, were there ways of characterising what knowledge mobilisation agencies were doing? And as Alison was mentioning yesterday, out of this work we developed the idea of at least 8 archetypes, which are not meant to be categories, ways of classifying different organisations, but they're ways of sort of idealised types, ways of trying to characterise particular approaches to knowledge mobilisation, and any one agency may well be combining 2, 3 or more of these archetypes. They were derived inductively rather than sort of being literature derived. And these are the 8 archetypes. So they're the pushers. People who focus on research synthesis, they create knowledge products, but there's also an emphasis on trying to translate these into, or put them in accessible portals, repositories, and they're strong on communication strategies. So, as I mentioned earlier, some quite innovative things being done in terms of communication strategies. There were the brokering agencies, and some of these archetypes are paired because they share some important similarities. So there were brokering agencies, firstly, those who were concerned with brokering their own research, and then others that maybe didn't see themselves as research producers, but focused much more on brokering research from other sources, the wider research resources. And their emphasis was on translating these into usable things like toolkits, mythbusters, and they were also actively bringing people together to discuss how people then interpreted these toolkits, or might use these toolkits and mythbusters, and take actions. So these were the brokering archetypes. There were evidence advocates. So for these people, they were less concerned with creating knowledge products, or even concerned with particular bodies of knowledge. They were much more concerned with getting the right attitudes, appetites, and conditions for evidence use. So if you want an example, those of you who are aware of the Alliance for Useful Evidence, then that's we would see as primarily working as an evidence advocate. There were research and practice organisations who were mainly concerned with working collaboratively on implementation with service providers, either seeking to draw on research from outside of the organisation and get that into action, or seeking the research in practice, seeking to work in a co-productive way to develop evidence in situ. There were people who were much more focused on fostering networks, which we've discussed on several occasions. Maybe this idea, there's some good examples of those, the good cops and the bad cops. And finally, this category of advancing knowledge mobilization work, building knowledge about knowledge work, aiming to evaluate what they do and working much more focused on that. We also looked at what works in knowledge mobilization, and lots of caveats here that there's a very limited empirical evidence base on all aspects of knowledge mobilization. A lot of it is in healthcare, and so we need much more from other sectors. And the evaluation studies that we do have are often small scale and what many people would see as quite poor quality, because they don't often actually make it clear what research use means in this particular project. But there are some emerging findings that come through from the literature review and the agency's own evaluation work, and I've listed some of those there, and I won't talk through them. And I think many of them will be familiar to you, again, stating the blindingly obvious, because of all of the conversations that we've had so far. I think one, I don't know if it's frightening or reassuring message from all of this was many of them, this was just, thought there was a different slide coming next. pause a moment, come back. Just in terms of the knowledge broker role, what came through in terms of formative learning from agencies was that this is not an area for novices or conscripts. Yet what many people were talking about was that the area is staffed by young people, newly into post, novices, or people who were pressured in some way to take on these roles. So there was a bit of definitely a tension there. Because people needed to be able to cope with lots of ambiguity, and you needed to be pretty experienced, pretty knowledgeable, etc. And the importance of user involvement, user commitment was also seen as an important emerging set of learning. Going so far as to say that if you're going to do this, the people that you work with need to have some skin in the game. That might be that they're sort of co-funding this work, or that they are in terms of actual cash, or in terms of human resources. So that was coming through strongly. What I thought was going to come next was this, either frighteningly or reassuringly, many of the things that were coming through this project seemed to reaffirm what came out from our sort of 2007 book that reviewed the literature on what works and effective practice for knowledge mobilization, where these features of effective research use practices, that research needs to be translated, ownership is key, the need for enthusiasts, both in the user organizations and for enthusiasts in knowledge broker roles, the importance of contextual analysis. Very few agencies had very sophisticated methods for analyzing contexts, and hence tailoring as a result of that. Credibility, which is not the same as ideas of methodological research quality. Leadership within research impact settings, the top-down buy-in, and the need for support. And we've talked a lot about that need of support as part of the knowledge mobilization, but also organizations who are implementing evidence-based interventions and programs also need that support of varying sorts, not just technical support, and integration of new activities with existing systems. So that's a very brief and slightly rushed through some of the findings from that research project. In terms of wider reflections, I would agree with Peter's, when you were doing that lovely wide sweep of what's been happening within Canada, I think also what we see in the UK is an enormous growth in both interest and activity in knowledge mobilization work, and a lot of very exciting things happening. What's slightly frustrating to someone like me who studies these things is, unless I interact with people, I don't find out about them because so little of it is documented. So much of the exciting work is in people's heads, but not documented. There seem to me to be lots of promising initiatives. That's not to say that some of the examples I've given here, and the examples are only the ones that I've had a little bit of involvement with, that they're all without problems. They've got many problems, but it seems to me that there's there's some really exciting things happening in all of these areas. And we can talk a bit more about any of those if you want, people in the audience who know more about them than I do. I think there has been some increase in evaluation activity, not as much as I would like to see. So I've been really heartened by how many people have been interested in how do we evaluate impact and how do we then think about what might have contributed to that impact. And in that respect, because much of the work we currently have is so health-focused, I'm really excited about the work that the Education Endowment Fund are now doing in the education area. I think the scale of the evaluation activity that they are undertaking is amazing, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. And I think there are lots of success stories on which to build, as well as some failures which we also need to learn from, but those definitely don't get talked about or documented as much. So lots of things that I find to be exciting and heartening and give me hope for the future. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Sandra. Who's got a question for Sandra? Yes.
Don't have to walk too far this time. That was brilliant. Thank you. You mentioned about some creative ways of pushing. You heard some examples. Could you give us some ideas of what they were?
I mean, I can, but almost better still, I could point to some people in the audience. So, for example, one of the organisations that we looked at, and I hope this isn't betraying research confidentiality too much, but it's a nice story, so it's okay, was looking at Iris. So I think that some of the work that Iris is doing around sharing knowledge products, the ways in which they are trying to communicate in so many different ways, using digital technologies, using, some of Alison's slides included cartoons, and so I think they have been experimenting with different ways, some of which I'm sure have worked really well, others have maybe not had quite as much impact. So I think those are really good. So I think there are good things there. Quite a number of people, when we talked about innovation, immediately started talking about social media tools. With a little bit of skepticism, so they were excited about reach. That was the thing that was exciting them about the reach, but really concerned about the levels of activity and engagement that followed on from that reach.
Hi, Sandra. Thanks for that. That was great. I'm wondering if you can think about how some of the people are reacting to the archetypes, and whether they see themselves in a matrix, whether they see themselves in all of them. My first reaction when I look at this and I think about the Institute, that we fit into D, G, and H, right? That we're very much about this kind of advocate role, very much about networks, and very much about advancing the process. But we don't do research because there's lots of other people who do. Right? And so we're in a kind of meta supporting role to them. And I'm just wondering what sort of reactions people are having to the archetypes, and how are they seeing themselves, and how is that perhaps disrupting their own identities?
We've talked about the archetypes now with several organisations individually, as well as doing some sessions in workshop form. The reaction has been quite positive, because we're not presenting them as these are there's some archetypes that are good and others that are bad. It's not hierarchical, and neither are we saying you have to sort of decide on one rather than another, which would be. But what people have found quite useful is to reflect. Most people are able to identify, as you've said, at least 3 or 4 that they can say, yeah, we're doing some of that. But it's really then helping them think about the balance of what they do, and any of that they're not currently focusing on, do they want to? Was it oversight or was it deliberate? The thing I should say about the archetypes is that the next piece of work, I think, is we know quite a bit about the features of some of these archetypes. We don't really know how to deliver them well. So beginning to unpick, okay, if this is, looking at archetype by archetype, what would be good? But then also thinking, well, when you blend them together, if we know that there are tensions when you start to blend things together, what are some of the tensions you need to be aware of? What are some of the trade-off balances that you need to navigate through? So far, the reaction that we've been made aware of, certainly, has been very positive, that people find them a good, reflective tool. I haven't had a chance to share with you today, but we sort of developed a bit more some descriptors and questions falling under each of these archetypes that would help people then get into them a little bit more.
Sandra, you mentioned that you were quite excited about the efforts that are being put into research impact evaluation right now. So as a Canadian looking at the UK situation, my question is about the REF. What, if anything, has it added to this discourse?
A lot of people would give you quite a negative picture, I think. I wouldn't. I think the REF, the emphasis on impact has been good in that it has given credibility to this work. It's raised the profile of this work. It's got people thinking about now, what do we mean by research impact? And yes, of course, some of the ways in which it was interpreted in the ref, as I think one of Sarah's slides yesterday indicated, was not necessarily terribly sophisticated, maybe a bit too broad, but nevertheless, it's a step in the right direction. I think there's a danger now that there are various people proposing research studies which were going to take the ref impact case studies and use them as a database as if they were factual. Whereas we know that, and I wrote one, so I know that they were a very selective presentation of data. They were telling a story, hopefully one that would convince. But nevertheless, maybe it gives you some essence of how people are talking about these things, what sort of language they are using, and where we seem to have some strengths and maybe also some limitations. So I see the ref as, in terms of I guess I'm one of a proselytizer for evidence use. I would see it as one of those things that makes it a little bit more of a conducive environment for some of the messages I wanted to give, but maybe I'd want to soften the edges of it a bit more. And I think what's exciting in terms of the focus now on evaluation methods is that we are having good conversations now about what sort of evaluation frameworks might work, how we might take ideas of theories of change that have being used within service settings and apply them to this work, the contribution analysis that people have had. And the exciting thing I think about the Education Endowment Fund is that they're doing very much large scale, but multi-method. They are doing some randomized control trials of particular approaches within that, but they're also doing an awful lot of process evaluation. They're doing a massive survey of organizations. They're doing longitudinal surveys. So, they will be following up over many years with a very wide set of data, what's happening in schools. So I think these are exciting times.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and I really liked the balance between the bright and the dark side. It was very nicely balanced. I've got a theoretical business school style question. I'm very interested in power, and at an individual level, one of the comments that was made today is that knowledge brokers have to leave their egos at the doors, to which I would respond, yes, probably this is true, but then you can get some ego boosting through getting fulfillment in connecting other people and helping other people, and actually connections can make you powerful, but this is at the individual level, at the level of brokers. Here, in your presentation, we are mainly talking about organizations. And my question is, to what extent do those knowledge brokering organizations, so archetypes B and C and others, but not A's probably, to what extent do they manage to acquire sufficient power and credibility to influence other organizations? And to what extent are they perceived as powerful players in the field? Or is it just muddling through and getting at least some influence, but basically admitting that we are not really influential?
There are a whole range of agencies captured within our sample here. So one of the agencies that we talked with was NICE. And so they would see where they sit within the system of healthcare as being reasonably powerful in terms of the guidelines that are developed and then the work that they do with those guidelines. Others are much more small scale, and for most of those, the development of sufficient credibility often, and then the ability to influence comes over a long period of time, is associated with particular individuals. And you're only as good as your last set of interactions on those occasions. For some people, they wouldn't necessarily want to judge themselves on how powerful they are or feel or are judged to be, but whether people find the sorts of support and advice that they are offering that it is useful and productive and effective. But it is quite a difficult balancing act, I think, because most of these organisations are dependent on a range of funding or one or two main funders to keep going. So you want to be able to prove your effectiveness to them. So you maybe don't want to leave your ego behind because you want to be able to claim some of the credit for this. But nevertheless not wanting to overclaim. And as I think David was saying, giving the example earlier that the good knowledge brokerage is like cellophane, you can't see it. And so I think there are tensions there around developing a profile that will get you the sorts of resources you need to continue the work whilst not getting in the way of the work because you are damaging your reputation by maybe overclaiming or being seen as trying to not help people and support them with where they want to go, but steering them in the direction that you want them to go. So I think there are lots of tensions there with that question.
In healthcare in the UK, there's been a significant growth in patient and public involvement and service users. Yet in your research, the organisations that you looked at with regard to knowledge mobilisation, there's been very little service user involvement. Can you say a little bit more about that and why why you think that deficit, maybe that lack, maybe?
I don't know why. I could only begin to speculate, and I'm not sure it would be necessarily helpful speculation. I think most people, when asked about it, when we're asking about it, we're somewhat apologetic and almost suggesting, well, maybe that's our next step. And to be sure, when we started to talk to people about the history of their organisation, often they were focused initially on developing their knowledge products, then developing to push them, then developing their networks, and then latterly they were then starting to think about, well, we need to get much more service user involvement in defining what we do, and maybe then also in helping us do what we do. So whether it's about sort of a model of from the most well-bounded bits of it to the more challenging, boundaryless aspects of this activity, I don't know, but that would be some of my speculation. I think it's also where people come from. So I'm sure if we went around this room and asked people, what's your background, many people would come from very different backgrounds. So it seems to be that those people who've come to knowledge mobilisation from more community development type backgrounds move more quickly, maybe even from the very beginning, to those sorts of engagement, whereas those who come to it either from a research production background or more from a librarian informatics background come to that aspect of the role, the challenge, the strategy much later.
Fantastic. Wasn't that brilliant? Thank you, Sandra.